Daniel stared at his sister Queeneth with pleading eyes. "Let's go to Uncle Ben's shop again. He won't notice if we take just a few things," he whispered. Tears welled up in Queeneth's eyes as she shook her head. "No, Brother Daniel. Remember what happened last time? Mama Blessing caught us and it was so embarrassing. I never want to steal again." How did these two children, raised in a good Christian home in Lagos, end up contemplating theft and even robbery at an early age? Why was 10-year-old Daniel trying to convince his 8-year-old sister to do something they both knew was wrong? And where were their parents during all of this? Stay with me as we uncover the story of Daniel and Queeneth. Brown Street in Surulere was always noisy. Every morning when the sun came up, street sellers would start shouting to sell their things. They would shout, "Buy fresh bread! Buy hot akara!" The yellow Danfo buses would honk their horns. The neighbors would say good morning to each other as they went to work. The Johnson family lived in a yellow building with 2 floors. The building had green windows that needed new paint. They lived on the top floor, and Daniel and Queeneth could see everything happening on the street from their small balcony. Their father, Mr. Johnson, was a serious person. He always wore clean, ironed suits and carried a black briefcase. He woke up very early at 4:30 a.m. when his alarm clock rang. The children could hear him walking around, getting ready for work. He worked as an accountant at First Bank of Nigeria in Victoria Island. This was where many big companies had their offices in tall buildings. Every morning before leaving, he would tell Daniel and Queeneth, "Study hard. Education is the key to success." Then he would fix his tie and run down the stairs to catch his work bus. Their mother, Mrs. Johnson, was very different from their father. She was always happy and active. She wore bright-colored head teas and colorful Ankara dresses. She owned a big shop in Balogun Market, where she sold new clothes from China, Dubai, and London. She would leave for work right after their father, carrying big bags of clothes to show her customers. Before leaving, she would quickly kiss them and say, "Be good children. Listen to Grandma, and remember to eat the food in the fridge." During the day, their grandmother, Mama Johnson, looked after Daniel and Queeneth. She was a small, kind woman with gray hair and warm brown eyes. She always wore a wrapper and blouse, and she kept mint sweets in a pocket of her wrapper for the children. Mama Johnson loved Nollywood movies. She had a stack of DVDs next to the TV with her favorite actors, like Pete Edochie, Patience Ozokwor, and Aki and Paw Paw. She would sit in her old rocking chair, which she brought from the village, and watch her movies for hours. Sometimes she would call out, "Come, my children. Let me tell you how things were in the village when I was young." But most times, she fell asleep in the middle of her stories, gently rocking in her chair. Daniel and Queeneth had to find ways to keep themselves entertained. Their toys were old and worn out, a football that kept deflating, some broken plastic soldiers, and a jump rope made from an old phone charger. Still, they played and made the best of it. Queeneth loved to draw. She used colored pencils saved from last term and carefully sharpened them when they got dull. She drew pictures of their family, the street outside, and what she imagined their parents' workplaces looked like. Daniel was more energetic. He liked to organize games with the other kids in the compound after school. They played police and thief in the parking lot, or football with their half-flat ball, using slippers as goalposts. Then, everything began to change. Mama Johnson started coughing at night. At first, it was just a little cough, but it got worse day by day. Soon, she was coughing all the time, and her usually cheerful face looked tired and pale. "It's nothing," she would say, brushing off their worried looks. "Just the Lagos dust." One evening, when their parents came home, they found Mama Johnson burning with a high fever. The next morning, instead of going to work, Mrs. Johnson took her mother-in-law to see Dr. Ken at the local clinic. "I need traditional medicine," Mama Johnson insisted. "My mother used to treat this sickness with herbs from our village in Enugu." After talking it over, their parents decided to send Mama Johnson back to the village for treatment. Early one morning, Mr. Johnson drove her to the motor park to catch a bus to the east. "Be good, my children," she said, hugging them tightly. This time, her wrapper pocket didn't have any sweets. "I'll come back when I'm feeling strong again." The house felt so different after Mama Johnson left. It was quiet and lonely. There were no more Nollywood movies on the TV, no stories about the village, and no mint sweets hidden in her wrapper pockets. Their parents tried to make plans. "You're big kids now," Mrs. Johnson said. "Daniel, you're 10, and Queeneth, you're 8. You can look after yourselves for a few hours after school, right?" Mrs. Blessing, their downstairs neighbor, said she would check on them sometimes. Mr. Sunday, the security guard at the gate, promised to watch out for them. Even Sister Agnes, who owned the shop across the street, said she'd help keep an eye on them. But things weren't the same. After school, the hours felt long and boring. The flat felt strange and empty without Mama Johnson around. Even the usual street noises, like people talking or cars honking, seemed scarier now. Every little sound made them nervous. The old rocking chair, now empty, creaked sometimes, and it made them jump. The shadows in the house seemed darker, and the silence felt heavy. For the first time, Daniel and Queeneth felt completely alone. And that's when the trouble started. With Mama Johnson gone, Daniel and Queeneth had to figure things out on their own. Every morning, they woke up at 6 a.m. to their mother's voice. "Hurry up, kids! You can't be late for school." For breakfast, they made simple meals, bread and tea or leftover rice from the night before. If they were lucky, there would be eggs in the fridge. Daniel tried frying them, but they often ended up burnt or broken. "At least it's still food," Queeneth would say, eating the burnt edges without complaining. Getting ready for school became harder too. With no one to help braid her hair, Queeneth wore simple rubber bands. Daniel often forgot to polish his shoes and got scolded during morning assembly. Their school, St. Michael's Primary, was only a 10-minute walk away. But now, instead of walking with Mama Johnson or their mom, they had to join the crowd of kids on the busy streets. "Hold my hand tight," Daniel told Queeneth when they crossed the roads. He tried to sound confident, but his sweaty palms gave away how nervous he really was. The hardest part of their day was coming home from school. Daniel wore the key to their flat on a string around his neck, hidden under his shirt. Every day, they climbed the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. Inside, the flat felt strange. It wasn't warm or welcoming anymore. It was too quiet, and even their favorite cartoons didn't make it feel better. Sometimes, Mrs. Blessing from downstairs would check on them. "Have you eaten?" she'd ask, peeking through their door. But she had her own family to care for, so her visits became rare. Their parents had left food in the freezer, soup and stew to warm up in the microwave. But often, they forgot to take it out early, or they burned their fingers trying to handle the hot bowls. "I miss Grandma's jollof rice," Queeneth would say, poking at the rice they had cooked, which was sometimes a little burnt. The afternoons felt long and boring. Daniel and Queeneth tried to do their homework, but math was tough without anyone to explain it. Their father had bought them new textbooks, but studying alone wasn't the same as having someone help. Some days, they heard other kids playing outside in the compound. Laughter and shouts from games like catch and hide and seek drifted up to their window. But their parents had strict rules. They weren't allowed to go downstairs without an adult watching them. "It's not safe," their mother had said. "Just stay inside and do your homework." From the balcony, they watched the other children run around and have fun. Sometimes, Daniel's friend Peter waved at them, but all they could do was wave back, feeling sad. At night, Daniel and Queeneth would sit on the balcony, watching the sun go down behind the buildings of Surulere. One by one, the streetlights would turn on, and they could hear the soft sounds of evening prayers from the nearby mosque. "When is Grandma coming back?" Queeneth would ask quietly, her voice full of hope. "Soon," Daniel would reply, though he wasn't sure. The phone calls from the village were short, and all they knew was that Mama Johnson was seeing a traditional healer, which could take time. Their parents would come home late, looking tired but trying to act cheerful. Their mother would check the food in the fridge and glance at their homework, while their father asked, "How was your day?" But they never had the energy to really listen. "Everything okay?" they would ask. "Yes," Daniel and Queeneth would always say, not wanting to make their parents worry. But everything wasn't okay. The house felt empty, and the loneliness weighed on them like a heavy blanket. They didn't know it yet, but this emptiness would soon push them to make choices they never thought they would. The sun was very hot that afternoon in Lagos. Daniel and Queeneth were walking home from St. Michael's Primary School, their uniforms soaked with sweat. The white shirts they had worn in the morning were now wrinkled and dirty, and their black shoes were dusty from the unpaved roads. Uncle Ben's shop was at the corner of their street, near a big mango tree that gave some shade. It wasn't a fancy shop, just a small space with wooden shelves and a roof made of zinc. But to the children passing by, it looked like a place full of treasures. The shop's window was filled with colorful treats. There were bright red and yellow sweets, shiny chocolate bars, and biscuits in colorful wrappers. The window was a little dusty, but children didn't care. They loved to press their noses against it, staring at the goodies inside. Daniel and Queeneth slowed down as they got closer to the shop. They saw their classmate Mary coming out with a pack of sweet biscuits. Mary broke the biscuits in half and shared them with her younger brother. Both of them looked happy. "Look at them, Queeneth," Daniel said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. His stomach made a loud growling sound. They had only eaten the last slice of bread for breakfast that morning. "Do you remember when Grandma used to buy us sweets every Friday?" Queeneth nodded, holding her empty water bottle tightly. Their father had become stricter about spending money since Mama Johnson went to the village. "We have to save for important things," he would say, as he gave them just enough money for their transport and a small lunch. They stood outside the shop, watching other children. Some bought chin-chin in little plastic bags. Others bought lollipops that turned their tongues different colors. Even the house help from the big house down the street came to buy chocolate for the children she cared for. That night, Daniel lay on his thin mattress, unable to sleep. The ceiling fan spun above him, making its usual squeaky sound, but it didn't help him relax like it usually did. His mind was stuck on the sweets in Uncle Ben's shop. To him, they felt like hidden treasures waiting to be taken. He thought about the little money his father gave them each day, just enough to buy rice and beans at the school canteen. Sometimes he and Queeneth saved a bit by drinking water instead of juice, or walking home instead of paying for a bus ride. But it was never enough for anything extra. The next day at school, during break time, something happened that Daniel would never forget. He was sitting under the mango tree, watching other kids eat their snacks, when his friend Peter ran over, looking excited. "Guys, come here," Peter called, waving for a group of boys to join him. He lowered his voice so no teachers would hear. "My cousin Deji from secondary school showed me something cool yesterday." The boys huddled around him. Daniel, Peter, 2 older boys from primary 5 and a new boy whose name Daniel didn't know leaned in to listen. Peter looked around to make sure no one else was nearby. "You know how some stuff in shops costs too much?" Peter began, his eyes darting around. "Well, my cousin has a trick to get things without paying. He does it all the time, and nobody catches him." Daniel's chest tightened. He knew stealing was wrong. His parents and Sunday school teacher had said it many times. But instead of leaving, he stayed to hear more. "It's easy," Peter whispered. "You just need 2 people. One talks to the shopkeeper and keeps him busy, acting like they want to buy something. The other sneaks something and hides it. That's it." One boy in the group didn't like the idea and quietly walked away, but Daniel stayed. His mind was racing. He thought about Queeneth. She was good at talking to adults, and she always looked innocent. After school, instead of heading home, Daniel stopped Queeneth near Uncle Ben's shop. "Queeneth," he whispered, feeling nervous. He wiped his sweaty palms on his shorts. "I need your help with something." Queeneth frowned. "What do you need help with?" she asked, looking worried. Daniel pulled her behind the big mango tree near the shop. His hands were shaking, and his heart was pounding. He was no longer sure this was a good idea. "Do you remember when Grandma used to buy us sweets every Friday?" he asked. "Yes," Queeneth said quietly. "I miss that." Daniel leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "I know how we can get sweets like that again. You just have to help me talk to Uncle Ben." Queeneth didn't like how Daniel was whispering. It reminded her of the pranks they used to plan, like hiding Grandma's slippers. But this didn't feel fun. It felt wrong. "I don't know, Daniel," she said hesitantly, looking at the ground. "Please," Daniel begged. "All you have to do is talk to him. That's it." Queeneth sighed and looked at her brother. He had always been there for her, helping her with homework and standing up for her at school. Maybe this one time she could do something for him. "Okay," she said softly, "but only this once." The 2 of them walked to Uncle Ben's shop together. The sun was blazing hot on their backs. When they reached the door, the small bell above it jingled as they stepped inside. Inside Uncle Ben's shop, the air smelled like biscuits and chocolate. The wooden shelves were filled with colorful sweets, shiny chocolate bars, and biscuit packets with pictures of smiling children. Uncle Ben stood behind the counter, arranging new drinks in a glass display. His shop was small but tidy, with everything neatly in place. A calendar with a picture of Jesus hung on the wall, and a small fan hummed, moving the hot air around. Daniel's heart was pounding so hard, it felt like everyone could hear it. His school uniform was damp with sweat, but it wasn't just because of the heat. What he was about to do made him nervous and scared. "Just ask him about the new pure water brand," Daniel whispered to Queeneth, nudging her toward the counter. "I'll handle the rest." Queeneth's legs felt shaky as she walked up to Uncle Ben. She liked him. He was always kind and sometimes gave children extra sweets. Now, she felt guilty about what they were planning. "Good afternoon, Uncle," Queeneth said, trying to sound polite. Her throat felt dry. "Ah, Johnson's children," Uncle Ben greeted with a big smile, showing the gap between his front teeth. "How is school? How is your grandmother?" Queeneth started asking questions about the new pure water, while Daniel slowly moved along the shelves, pretending to look at the sweets. His hands trembled as he glanced at Uncle Ben, who was busy explaining why his pure water was the cleanest in Lagos. Quickly, Daniel reached out and grabbed 2 Tom Tom sweets and a small pack of biscuits, slipping them into his pocket. His heart raced so fast, it was all he could hear. The bell above the door jingled as they left. Uncle Ben waved at them with his usual smile. "Come again, children. Tell your parents I said hello." Hearing that made Daniel's stomach twist. They hurried away from the shop without saying a word, only slowing down when they turned the corner. When they got home, Daniel and Queeneth went straight to their room and shut the door. Daniel took the sweets he had stolen out of his pocket and placed them on the bed. They didn't look exciting anymore. They just looked like a big mistake. "Try one," Daniel said, pushing a Tom Tom sweet toward Queeneth. Queeneth shook her head firmly. "I don't want it," she said softly, her voice trembling. She couldn't stop thinking about Uncle Ben's kind smile. Daniel unwrapped one anyway. The crinkling sound of the wrapper felt extra loud in the quiet room. He popped the candy into his mouth, but it didn't taste good at all. Instead of being sweet and enjoyable, it made his stomach turn and his mouth feel heavy. The next day at school, Peter walked up to Daniel during break time. "Did you do it?" Peter asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "Did you take something?" Daniel nodded slowly, trying to look confident, even though his stomach felt strange. Peter grinned and gave him a pat on the back, as if Daniel had done something impressive. "See? I told you it wasn't hard," Peter said proudly. "My cousin says the more you practice, the easier it gets." 2 days later, Daniel and Queeneth returned to Uncle Ben's shop. This time, Queeneth asked Uncle Ben about some exercise books, keeping him busy with her questions. While she talked, Daniel quietly slipped 3 chocolates and some bubble gum into his pocket. It felt easier than the first time. They weren't as nervous, and Daniel's hands barely shook. Daniel and Queeneth started visiting Uncle Ben's shop almost every other day. Each time, they came up with a new trick. Sometimes Queeneth would ask about school bags. Other times, she would act like she wanted to know the price of every drink in the fridge. While she kept Uncle Ben distracted, Daniel would quietly take sweets, biscuits, and even small toys. Something odd was happening. Queeneth started struggling to sleep at night. She would lie awake, thinking about Uncle Ben's kind face and how much he trusted them. During school, she couldn't focus on her lessons because she was so tired. Her eyes felt heavy, and it was hard to stay awake. "Queeneth, are you paying attention?" her teacher would ask. But Queeneth's mind was always somewhere else, thinking about the stealing and how wrong it was. Daniel was changing too. He began stealing more things from the shop. At first, he would grab just 2 sweets, but now he was taking 5. Whenever he saw something new, he felt like he had to take it. It wasn't fun or exciting anymore. It had turned into a bad habit that was taking him down a path from which he might never return. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, please let me know in the comments below by typing "continue." I'd love to hear what you learned from this story. Don't forget to like and share this story with your friends. And if you haven't already, subscribe to stay updated with all the new chapters coming your way. Your support means the world to me. See you next time.